congressional term limits are a topic of concern for many. So then, what can be done? As we know, the president has term limits, and that is due to the 22nd Amendment of the United States Constitution. So, most certainly you would think the Constitution addresses congressional term limits as well. Well, term limits for members of the United States Congress, which includes both the House of Representatives and the Senate, are not established by the U.S. Constitution. Currently, there are no restrictions on the number of terms that a member can serve, and this absence of term limits has led to significant debate about the need for reforms aimed at increasing political turnover, enhancing democratic representation, reducing the entrenchment of career politicians, and making Capitol Hill look a little bit less like a senior center. The U.S. Constitution grants Congress the authority to determine its own rules of procedure, and therein lies the problem. Article 1, Section 5 states that each House may determine the rules of its proceedings. However, this does not explicitly include the power to impose term limits. Any attempt to establish term limits would require an amendment to the Constitution, which necessitates a 2/3 majority vote in both the House and the Senate, then followed by ratification from 3/4 of the state legislatures. Numerous attempts have been made to impose term limits on Congress, particularly since the 1990s. One significant push occurred in 1994 when the Republican Party, under the leadership of Newt Gingrich, adopted a contract with America that included a proposal for congressional term limits. This led to a wave of support among voters. In 1995, the House passed a term limits amendment. However, it failed to pass in the Senate. In 1999, several states began to enact their own term limits for their congressional representatives. However, this approach faced legal challenges. The most notable case was U.S. Term Limits, Inc. versus Thornton in 1995. In this Supreme Court case, the court ruled that states cannot impose their own term limits on members of Congress. The court held that allowing states to set such limits would violate the Constitution by undermining the uniformity of federal elections. The U.S. Term Limits versus Thornton case is pivotal in the discussion of term limits. The Supreme Court ruled that the Constitution sets the qualifications for members of Congress in Article 1, Section 2, and Section 3, which includes age, citizenship, and residency requirements. The court stated that states do not have the authority to add additional qualifications, such as term limits for federal office holders. This decision was significant as it reaffirmed the idea that the qualifications for Congress and members of Congress are uniform across all states and cannot be altered by state legislation. The ruling effectively nullified state-imposed term limits, emphasizing that any changes to the structure of congressional terms must come through a constitutional amendment rather than state law. This has left proponents of term limits with limited avenues for reform, reinforcing the entrenchment of career politicians in Congress. The debate over term limits continues to be a contentious issue in American politics. Proponents argue that term limits would encourage fresh ideas, reduce the influence of lobbyists, and diminish the power of entrenched incumbents. Critics, however, contend that term limits could lead to a loss of legislative experience and continuity, potentially harming effective governing. Further, the Supreme Court's ruling in Thornton has established a legal precedent that complicates any grassroots or state-level efforts to impose term limits. As a result, the focus has shifted to advocating for a constitutional amendment, a process that requires significant political will and public support. So, while the determination of term limits in Congress is theoretically within the purview of Congress itself, the existing constitutional framework prevents the imposition of such limits without an amendment. The failed attempts in the landmark Supreme Court case, U.S. Term Limits versus Thornton, highlight the challenges and complexities surrounding this issue. As discussions continue, term limits remain a significant and contentious topic in the evolving and rather imperfect landscape of American governance.